Welcome back to the iNet Solution MemberProtect tutorials. Our first tutorial will be talking about organizations, and you can access that by clicking the Organizations link in the right-hand side menu. This will take us to a new screen that has three buttons at the top. These three are the organization type, create organization, and delete organization. Before we jump into those though, let's talk about organizations. Within MemberProtect, organizations are the highest level root item that contains all the other information such as users and roles and privileges, etc. Now, while MemberProtect doesn't require that you create an organization, it's generally advised that you create at least one for your own sanity, though it's not required. The organization, for that matter, doesn't even have to face the outside world. Again, MemberProtect is very, very flexible, and you can expose or not expose as much as you want. Before we start creating an organization, however, though, we have to talk about an organization types. And types are simply that. They're just a little designator to help you organize multiple organizations. In systems that have many, if not hundreds of organizations, it's usually a good idea to differentiate those within different types. For the purposes of this tutorial, it already has manufacturer, distributor, and retailer as types. But to illustrate how easy it is to create an organization type, we'll create a new one. I'm going to call this one Jelly Beans to prove 2 points. That it can be created and that it doesn't matter what it's called. While Jelly Beans has very little to do with manufacturing, distributing, and retailing, it might have significance in your solution. So again, it doesn't have to be business related, but an organization is whatever you define it to be. And in most cases, it probably will be a business function or a department within a corporation, etc. But since I like my Jelly Beans, I'm going to stick with them. We have to give our organization a name, and I'm going to call this Acme Candy. I'll be the owner, and I'll create a fake address. We'll place it here in Utica, Michigan, and create a fake zip and a fake phone number. And we'll go ahead and create that organization. We've filled in all the requirements. And it's created. I should stress that actually the only thing that MemberProtect technically cares about in regards to creating an organization are the type and the name. The rest of these fields are actually custom fields that I created for the purposes of this tutorial. You could have created any number of other fields that you want differently. So technically it's just these two fields that are required. Now that that's created, we might think, oh, why do I need an Acme Candy Company? And we probably don't need an Acme Candy Company, so I'll go ahead and delete that. By typing in the name and clicking delete organization, Acme Candy is deleted. If I try to delete some other organization that I didn't create, the system will tell us that we can't because it doesn't exist. There is a little bit of validation in these tutorials, but only enough to make our lives a little easier and save our sanity. So while these are the only three functions that we've showed in these tutorials, these are probably the most core functions that you'd be using in MemberProtect. And we can't possibly illustrate all of them. So let's take a look at the code behind that drives these pages specifically. We'll talk about the page load functionality here. This tacks on to the previous video that talks about how the project itself and the different pages are set up. In these tutorials, they all follow a general standard format that I've created for the purposes of this project. We've got an action query string that we change depending on which button is pressed. So back on the browser here, if I click on the type, you'll see that create type is now the action. If I create organization, that's the action. And that's what's driving what user interface is being displayed in the browser there. And that's what this code is driving behind the scenes. So we're hiding the different parts of the page and then showing them based on which action is being used. Obviously this isn't very sophisticated in terms of security and prevention of errors, but it illustrates and works perfectly for these tutorials. I also want to point out that the drop-down is being populated via that data access link to SQL set of classes. And what we're doing here is we're setting the value from the table as well as the text from the table based on these two different column names, and then telling it what the data source is, which is obviously the MP org types table, and then binding it through link to SQL. And that's what's populating the organization type dropdown. And that just shows a little bit of how, if you've never used link to SQL, I certainly implore you to check it out because it makes data access a lot easier. So moving on to the actual MemberProtect code, there's three functions that are associated with those three different buttons that were on the web page. The first being the create organization type. First we check, okay, is the type or the type that the user entered, is it not a blank string effectively? And if it's not, then we want to do something with it. So we add it. And this is the actual only MemberProtect code in this entire function. Remember back to the video before this one about the MemberProtect public property that access the MemberProtect object. That's what this is doing. This is again available to all the pages that we create. Then we access within that object. MemberProtect is broken down into multiple modules such as organizations and users, encryption, email, etc. So for the purpose of this page, we've used the organization module. And then on that module, there's an actual method called add org type for organization type. And then we just pass it whatever the user typed in which case I put jelly beans. And then we show a simple message whether it succeeded or not. And all this is doing is outputting either some text in green or some text in red or standard neutral text. So that's it for creating an organization type. If we move on down to the create organization function, it gets a little bit more involved, but no more complex. Again, we check to make sure that the name is a valid name. We don't want any blank names in the system. Then we simply do a check to get the ID based on that name. Now, if it exists, we're going to get an actual valid GUID. Everything in MemberProtect tables is all stored using unique GUID values. If something actually exists, we're going to get a real GUID value. If nothing exists, we're going to get the empty GUID, which is essentially a bunch of zeros that make up the GUID. And then we're going to use that ID and check the organization module again for using this exists method to see, okay, does this organization already exist or not? So if we already created Acme Candy Company, it would not allow us to create it again, obviously. In case there isn't, then it ran through this section of code to go ahead and create the organization. Now the first thing here is this function called add data item, again based on the organization module. This is where the developer is able to create custom information for a given organization. We have something similar for users that we'll talk about later. The first property is the name of the column. This has to conform to SQL or SQL Server naming conventions for columns. And in this case, I've got these 6: owner, address, city, state, zip, and phone. Obviously, you can come up with anything you'd like. Maybe you store social security numbers. Maybe you store multiple phone numbers. Maybe you store people's first and last names or emails, etc. Then the second property is, we'll go ahead and show IntelliSense here. Do we want this column to be encrypted, or the values in this column to be encrypted? If we say false, which is what all these are, it's going to be stored as straight text. All of these custom information is nvarchar type data. And so if we pass in me, the owner, then my name will come back or be stored in the database as we typed it in. But if we've said true, then MemberProtect would do some automatic encryption for you to automatically encrypt the values, which is very important for sensitive data like social security numbers and credit card information and maybe even first and last name information in a very highly secure system. The last parameter here is the length of the maximum length that we're going to allow in that column. So you're essentially setting what the nvarchar integer value is for the length. In this case, it's 50 characters for the owner, address, and city, and then 2 characters for the state, and 10 for the zip, and 12 for the phone. All configurable by you. Normally, you probably wouldn't want this function to be in a function like this because it's going to be called multiple times. You only actually have to call these functions once for the column to exist. So these are actually better created for a creation routine. But it's not hurting anything to call it multiple times. It'll know that the column already exists and just ignore it.